January 1943. A dense, humid jungle on the outskirts of Guadalcanal. The air is thick with the scent of earth and decay. Through the canopy, the sun struggles to break through, casting patches of light onto the dark undergrowth below. The crack of gunfire reverberates, the sharp, staccato rhythm of battle punctuating the tense silence that precedes it. Amidst the chaos, a lone American gunner, crouched behind the remnants of a ruined shack, peers through his makeshift sight. A rifle welded to scrap parts from old tanks, broken planes, and abandoned weapons. Sweat stings his eyes, the weight of the weapon almost unbearable, but his focus is unshakable. In the distance, the sound of Japanese forces advancing grows louder. A flash of movement, a squad of enemy soldiers rounding a bend, flickers through his sights. He braces. The barrel of the gun shifts ever so slightly, the world narrowing to the view through the scope. With a breath, he fires. One shot, then another, and another. Each round finds its target, sending the Japanese soldiers crumpling to the ground. In mere minutes, 20 men, once a formidable threat, lie motionless, a testament to the unlikeliest of weapons. The Japanese had never seen anything like it. A weapon built from the scraps of war, wielded by a soldier who refused to surrender, had just turned the tide of this skirmish. The Pacific War, 1943. By this point, the U.S. and its allies had been locked in a brutal struggle against Imperial Japan for more than 2 years. The tide of the war had shifted following key victories at Midway and Guadalcanal, but the Japanese Empire was far from defeated. The islands of the Pacific, scattered across thousands of miles of open ocean, had become sites of relentless combat. Each battle was more grueling than the last, each victory hard-won. The U.S. forces, still learning to adapt to the unforgiving conditions of the Pacific, had begun to develop tactics that combined firepower, ingenuity, and a relentless will to succeed. Guadalcanal, a lush island located in the Solomon Islands chain, had been the site of one of the most pivotal campaigns of the Pacific War. It was here, in the midst of dense jungles and swamps, that U.S. Marines had first encountered the full strength of the Imperial Japanese Army's jungle warfare tactics. But what many soldiers didn't know was that, within the dense, tropical landscape, they were also about to learn a harsh lesson in the value of resourcefulness. For the American forces, Guadalcanal was not just a battle for territory, it was a fight for survival. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition, food, and weapons were in short supply, forcing soldiers and commanders alike to make do with what they had. Soldiers on the front lines were often faced with broken weapons, misfiring rifles, and malfunctioning equipment. But necessity, as the saying goes, is the mother of invention. The scarcity of resources on Guadalcanal, and in the Pacific theater more broadly, led to creative and often unorthodox solutions. It was within this environment of desperation and ingenuity that one soldier's scrap heap creation would become the symbol of an unexpected turn in the tide of battle. The gunner, a member of a small U.S. Army infantry unit stationed on the island, had become all too familiar with the frustrations of malfunctioning equipment. His unit, far from any logistical support and deep within enemy-held territory, had been relying on a mishmash of weapons, some salvaged from the wreckage of American bombers and tanks, others pilfered from the battlefield. The makeshift weapon he had crafted, a crude, welded-together rifle, was nothing more than a desperate solution to a looming problem: how to stay alive when there was no time or resources to fix what was broken. As the Japanese forces pressed forward in their attempts to retake the island, the U.S. soldiers were constantly outgunned and outnumbered. The Japanese, well-equipped and battle-hardened, had the upper hand in most engagements. But in the quiet moments between firefights, when the jungle's heavy silence would descend again, there was a certain sense of fatalism among the men. They knew that their survival depended on whatever means they could muster, be it firepower, cunning, or sheer force of will. But the creation of this makeshift gun, born from a wrecked battlefield and a soldier's unyielding determination, was about to become a turning point. This was no ordinary weapon. Its construction represented a new kind of warfare, where victory wasn't solely determined by superior technology, but by the ability to innovate under pressure. It was in this moment of sheer necessity that a weapon fashioned from nothing but scraps would go on to deal a blow to the Japanese forces that they would not soon forget. The scene was set: a soldier, a broken battlefield, and an enemy force that underestimated the resilience of the men they sought to defeat. All that remained was the gunfire. As the battle for Guadalcanal raged on, American forces were continuously pushed to their limits. The island had become a crucible, testing the endurance and resolve of the men who fought there. For many, it wasn't just a physical battle. It was a mental and emotional struggle, as the constant threat of death, coupled with the overwhelming heat and humidity of the jungle, took a heavy toll. The U.S. Army was hampered by logistical nightmares. Supplies were often delayed or never arrived at all, and the communication lines were frequently cut off. For many soldiers, the lack of sufficient weapons and ammunition meant that their survival often depended on their ingenuity. What would have been a simple matter of resupply in a more conventional conflict became a complex problem of resource management and makeshift repairs. Field maintenance of weapons, vehicles, and other vital equipment was not a luxury but a necessity for survival. The standard-issue weapons available to U.S. soldiers, such as the M1 Garand rifle and the Browning automatic rifle bar, were effective in most situations. However, the exigencies of jungle warfare, particularly in the dense, oppressive undergrowth of Guadalcanal, highlighted the limitations of these weapons. The close-quarters nature of combat, combined with the high humidity, led to frequent malfunctions. Even the M1911 pistol, a mainstay of U.S. forces, often jammed under the humid conditions. Ammunition could be dampened, magazines could fail, and even the most reliable of firearms would misfire at the most critical of moments. For soldiers like the gunner in our story, relying on standard-issue weapons was no longer an option. His weapon, a welded-together conglomeration of parts salvaged from tanks, abandoned fighter planes, and damaged rifles, was a symbol of the harsh realities they faced. He had pieced together this unorthodox creation from whatever he could find. A piece of a B-17 bomber's nose gun here, a broken M1 Garand barrel there, welded together in a crude approximation of a functioning firearm. The weapon was not perfect. Far from it. It was prone to overheating, misfired frequently, and lacked the range and precision of a regular rifle. But it had one key advantage. It worked when no other weapon could. The gun's function was simple: fire a single shot, and then another using the homemade trigger mechanism. The recoil was heavy, and the sights were rudimentary, but it was effective enough in the short-range, close-quarters combat that was all too common on Guadalcanal. For this gunner, it wasn't about elegance or precision, it was about making do with what he had. The jungle was a place where conventional warfare tactics were rendered almost useless. The dense foliage, the suddenness of ambushes, and the lack of visibility all made traditional fire and maneuver tactics less effective. Soldiers had to adapt on the fly. The gunner's weapon, built from the detritus of war, embodied this very adaptation. When the gunner entered the battlefield on that fateful day, he had no idea how pivotal his weapon would prove to be. His small unit had been sent to hold a strategic position on the island, one that the Japanese were determined to retake. The Japanese forces, equipped with well-maintained weapons and the support of aircraft, advanced with the confidence of a well-organized military force. The American unit was vastly outnumbered and under-equipped, but they were determined to hold their ground. As the Japanese soldiers closed in on their position, the gunner's makeshift weapon, dubbed the scrap gun by his comrades, was put to the test. Initially, it seemed like just another stopgap measure in a war full of desperate improvisation. But as he fired shot after shot, each one finding its mark, the tide began to shift. The gun's crude power proved to be devastating at close range, taking out Japanese soldiers one after another. The weapon's impact on the battlefield was undeniable. The Japanese forces, accustomed to the sudden onslaughts of U.S. firepower, had not anticipated an attack from such an unexpected source. The element of surprise worked in the gunner's favor, allowing him to inflict heavy casualties and stall the Japanese advance. With each successive shot, the enemy's confidence faltered. What had seemed like a minor engagement suddenly turned into a major setback for the Japanese forces. But the gunner's success was not just about the effectiveness of his weapon. It was about the creativity, the ingenuity, and the spirit of resilience that had driven him to craft something from nothing. This was not the first time the American forces had relied on such resourcefulness, but it was one of the most memorable. Despite the resource challenges, the soldiers on Guadalcanal had begun to realize that they could overcome even the most dire of circumstances by thinking outside the box. The gunner's scrap weapon embodied this mentality: make do, improvise, and adapt. As the engagement unfolded, the Japanese forces began to retreat, stunned by the unexpected ferocity of the American response. The gunner had proven that even in the most challenging of circumstances, a soldier's ingenuity could make all the difference. In that moment, the battlefield wasn't just a place for gunfire and violence. It was a stage for human ingenuity, resilience, and the unexpected power of making something from nothing. The gunner was not an extraordinary man by military standards. He was an average soldier like the others in his unit. He wasn't a trained engineer, nor was he a master of weaponry. What set him apart was his refusal to accept defeat. On Guadalcanal, where every soldier faced impossible odds, it was the same resilience that drove him to craft a weapon from spare parts, an act born of necessity rather than ambition. In the heat of battle, as bullets whizzed past and the cries of comrades filled the air, he was calm. In those quiet moments, when the jungle closed in and the weight of the situation threatened to break his resolve, he remained focused. Each shot he fired was not just a matter of survival. It was a statement of his ability to persevere in a war that constantly demanded more than human strength could give. The fear was there, but so was the determination. He had seen too many of his fellow soldiers fall to the relentless assault of the Japanese to allow himself to falter. The weapon, crude and imperfect as it was, had become an extension of his will to survive. In the most dangerous moment of his life, when every second seemed to stretch into an eternity, he was able to achieve the unthinkable, turning a piece of scrap into an instrument of death. The battle itself became a mirror for the human experience of war. It was about enduring, adapting, and finding strength in places where there seemed to be none. The gunner knew that his ingenuity wasn't just about killing. It was about survival in its rawest, most primal form. The battle on Guadalcanal was not a textbook engagement. There were no neat lines of fire or controlled advances. The terrain itself was a weapon, and the conditions were unforgiving. The Japanese forces, highly disciplined and experienced in jungle warfare, knew how to exploit the environment for tactical advantage. Their movements were swift and decisive, using the dense foliage to conceal their advances, moving like ghosts through the undergrowth. The U.S. soldiers, many of whom were inexperienced in the specifics of jungle combat, were forced to adjust on the fly. The makeshift gun used by the gunner, crafted from a mix of salvaged parts, wasn't the most accurate or efficient weapon. It had no long-range capabilities and could barely withstand sustained fire without overheating. Yet, in the specific conditions of this battle, it became the perfect tool for the moment. The close-quarters nature of jungle fighting, where the range of combat was often no more than a few dozen yards, favored weapons that could deliver rapid, powerful shots at short distances. The gun, though rudimentary, was effective in this context. In many ways, its very imperfection gave it a unique advantage. Its crude construction meant that it was less likely to malfunction under the harsh conditions of the jungle, something that more sophisticated weapons struggled with. Its simplicity allowed the gunner to fire it with relative ease, without worrying about jams or misfires. The enemy, too, underestimated its potential. They were accustomed to facing well-equipped soldiers with advanced weaponry, not an improvised gun that seemed to have materialized out of desperation. Each time the gunner squeezed the trigger, the weapon delivered a message. He wasn't just firing at the Japanese soldiers in front of him. He was defying the odds. The surprise, the shock of it, was as much a weapon as the gun itself. As Japanese soldiers fell one after another, the U.S. unit gained precious seconds to reorganize and adjust their positions. The scrap-together gun wasn't just a tool of destruction, it was a tactical disruption, throwing off the Japanese plans and forcing them to reconsider their approach. While the U.S. forces lacked the technological superiority that the Japanese had in certain areas, such as air support and artillery, This gun became a symbol of the tactical ingenuity that could tip the scales in combat. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, it wasn't always about superior firepower. Sometimes, it was about exploiting the enemy's expectations and creating chaos in the midst of controlled violence. And in that sense, the gun's crude design, much like the soldiers who wielded it, was perfectly suited to the battle they were fighting. The technological landscape of World War II was defined by rapid innovation, as both the Axis and Allied powers sought to outpace each other in a constant arms race. Yet, in the Pacific theater, where the dense jungles of islands like Guadalcanal presented unique challenges, technology often failed to live up to expectations. The standard-issue weapons and vehicles that had been so effective in the European theater of war were less suited to the brutal conditions of the Pacific. On Guadalcanal, the U.S. military had initially relied on a variety of standard-issue firearms, such as the M1 Garand rifle, the Barr Browning automatic rifle, and the M1911 pistol. These weapons were formidable in open combat, but in the swampy, rain-soaked jungles of the Solomon Islands, they were prone to malfunction. Moisture could seize up bolts, cause magazines to misfire, and turn ammunition into useless scrap. Soldiers, stripped of their technological advantages, were forced to make do with whatever they could find. The weapon used by the gunner was, in many ways, a product of this environment. Constructed from a patchwork of parts, some from broken-down tanks, others from wrecked bombers, the gun was an unrefined weapon that lacked the sophistication of standard-issue firearms. It lacked the range, the accuracy, and the long-term reliability of a manufactured weapon. But its very flaws gave it a certain ruggedness that proved essential in the conditions of the Pacific. The scrap gun, as it came to be known, was a testament to the fact that warfare was not just about the technology at hand, it was about how that technology was used in the moment. Where superior weaponry failed, improvisation stepped in. The gun's rudimentary design allowed it to operate in the unforgiving conditions of the jungle. Unlike the M1 Garand, which often jammed in the rain, or the Barr, which could overheat quickly in sustained firefights, the scrap gun was a straightforward weapon, one that could be assembled and fired with minimal tools, and one that could withstand the harsh tropical environment for a short burst of fire. Its effectiveness, then, was not in spite of its lack of refinement, but because of it. The simplicity of the scrap gun allowed it to function where more complex weapons failed. And in a war where survival often depended on the ability to adapt, this makeshift weapon became a symbol of American ingenuity. It was a clear example of how technology, when combined with creativity, could become an invaluable asset, even in the most challenging circumstances. While the scrap gun would never be mistaken for a high-tech marvel, in the jungle of Guadalcanal, it was the right weapon for the job. This was a battle not just of firepower, but of adaptability and the will to make the most of what little was available. For the Japanese forces, the battle on Guadalcanal was a crucial one. Their goal was to reclaim the island from the Americans, who had recently seized control of it in a bold and costly campaign. The Japanese forces were highly disciplined, experienced in jungle warfare, and well-equipped with some of the finest weapons of the era. The Imperial Army soldiers were trained to fight in the dense, humid jungles of the Pacific, and they had a well-established advantage in terms of both numbers and firepower. The American soldiers, on the other hand, were far from prepared. Many of them had never seen combat before Guadalcanal, and they were up against seasoned veterans of Japan's brutal expansionist campaigns. Yet, despite these apparent disadvantages, the U.S. forces were beginning to hold their ground, thanks to a combination of raw determination and unexpected ingenuity. When the gunner fired his makeshift weapon and killed the first of the Japanese soldiers, the enemy would have had no idea what they were up against. The Japanese forces were used to facing American soldiers armed with rifles, machine guns, and artillery. They had little reason to suspect that the U.S. soldiers would resort to such desperate measures. It was a shock to the Japanese soldiers, who were accustomed to facing well-organized, well-armed troops. The sudden appearance of a weapon built from scrap parts would have thrown them into confusion. The Japanese strategy was often built on the assumption that American forces, although numerous, would lack the resources and will to maintain prolonged engagements. Their military doctrine emphasized precision, discipline, and the ability to outlast and outfight the enemy through overwhelming force. But what they didn't anticipate on Guadalcanal was that the Americans would fight not just with their weapons, but with their wits. This scrap gun, despite its crude appearance, was a symbol of that ingenuity. And for the Japanese forces, it was a disruptive force on the battlefield. The surprise nature of the weapon would have been a psychological blow to the Japanese. The Japanese were known for their shock tactics, their ability to instill fear in the hearts of their opponents. But in this instance, the roles were reversed. It was the Japanese who were shocked, faced with an enemy they had underestimated, using a weapon that was both unexpected and devastating. The gunner's ingenuity, in the eyes of the Japanese soldiers, may have appeared almost mythical, a reflection of the kind of creativity and determination that the Japanese had always prided themselves on, but now it was being used against them. This psychological impact was significant. The Japanese had always prided themselves on their technological superiority. They had aircraft, artillery, and naval support that far outstripped what the U.S. forces had in the Pacific. To face an enemy who used a weapon crafted from nothing more than discarded materials would have been unsettling. It was a reminder that, even in the direst of situations, the human spirit could adapt and overcome. In this case, it wasn't just the tactical advantage that made the scrap gun so effective. It was the mental edge it gave to the American forces, who had started to realize that victory didn't always come from superior firepower, but from the ability to think differently. For the Japanese, the engagement proved to be a wake-up call. They had been trained to fight against the conventional tactics of well-armed opponents, but here, in the jungles of Guadalcanal, they faced something altogether different. A force that was willing to sacrifice technology in favor of ingenuity. The gunner's weapon had changed the dynamic on the battlefield, forcing the Japanese forces to rethink their assumptions about the American will to fight. Leadership in wartime is not just about commanding troops. It's about inspiring them to overcome insurmountable odds. On Guadalcanal, leadership played a crucial role in shaping the way U.S. soldiers adapted to the relentless pressure of the Pacific Campaign. In an environment where logistics failed, where resupply was often delayed or never came, and where soldiers faced exhaustion and desperation, the officers in charge were tasked with more than just making strategic decisions. They had to find ways to keep their men motivated, resourceful, and focused on survival. For the soldiers on Guadalcanal, the leadership they received was vital. Commanders and non-commissioned officers alike had to lead by example, often putting themselves in harm's way to boost morale and show their men that they would fight alongside them. At the same time, the improvisational nature of the engagement demanded a leadership style that encouraged autonomy and initiative. When standard tactics and equipment failed, commanders needed to empower their soldiers to innovate. It was a shift in military thinking, one that recognized the importance of adaptive thinking over rigid protocol. In the case of the gunner with the scrap gun, leadership's influence is clear. While the gunner's ingenuity was his own, it would have been unthinkable without the environment cultivated by his commanding officers. An environment where creative thinking was encouraged, where soldiers were empowered to solve problems as they arose. The gunner had learned how to improvise not just because he had no choice, but because his leaders fostered a sense of autonomy. They knew that victory on Guadalcanal would not come from simply following orders. It would come from the ability to make decisions in the heat of the moment, to turn a disadvantage into an advantage. It was leadership that pushed the gunner to use whatever was at his disposal, even when the chances of success seemed slim. At a time when material resources were in short supply, the leadership on Guadalcanal understood that they couldn't rely solely on traditional means of combat. They had to encourage their men to think beyond the confines of standard weaponry and equipment, to improvise and adapt. In the case of the gunner, that meant taking a broken-down battlefield and turning it into a proving ground for innovation. This approach to leadership also had a significant psychological impact on the troops. Knowing that their officers trusted them to come up with solutions to problems, that they were not bound by bureaucracy or rigid doctrine, created a sense of ownership and confidence. It wasn't just about the soldiers following orders. It was about them taking the initiative to solve problems that others might have thought unsolvable. The gunner's scrap weapon was just one example of how U.S. forces began to rethink warfare in the Pacific, not as a series of battles fought with superior equipment, but as a conflict of human ingenuity, where leadership played a critical role in ensuring success. Leadership on Guadalcanal was, therefore, not just about commanding troops in battle, It was about fostering a sense of creative independence and resilience in the face of overwhelming adversity. The U.S. commanders knew that to succeed in the Pacific, they had to be flexible, innovative, and willing to trust their men to take risks. The gunner's weapon, a crude yet effective tool of war, was a testament to that philosophy of leadership. It demonstrated that, in the right hands, even the most basic tools could become instruments of victory. It was an overcast morning on Guadalcanal, the air thick with humidity and the persistent buzz of insects. The jungle was quiet, eerily so, but the stillness was an illusion. The Japanese forces had been probing American positions for days, testing for weaknesses, searching for any opportunity to retake the critical island. This was the front line, where every tree, every mound of dirt, could shelter an enemy soldier. The U.S. forces had been holding their ground, but they were outnumbered, exhausted, and desperate. Supplies were running low, morale was wavering, and the enemy was relentless. The gunner, part of a small group tasked with holding a key defensive position, was crouched low behind a crumbling defensive barricade made of sandbags and scraps. His comrades had been fighting for days without a break, their weapons and ammunition quickly dwindling. But it wasn't just the lack of resources that weighed heavily on them. It was the growing sense that they were always one step away from being overrun. The jungle seemed to close in on them from all sides, and the occasional sound of enemy gunfire only heightened the tension. When the Japanese finally launched their assault, it came with a force that the U.S. forces couldn't afford to ignore. Hundreds of soldiers, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush, advanced quickly and silently, their intent clear: reclaim Guadalcanal at any cost. The American troops, their positions exposed and vulnerable, were outmatched in nearly every respect, except one: the gunner's improvised weapon. He had been watching the enemy move closer through the scope of his hastily assembled rifle, his heart pounding, his mind calculating every possible shot. His weapon, a crude assemblage of scrap parts, seemed almost laughable in comparison to the well-oiled, high-tech rifles wielded by the Japanese. But it didn't matter. The moment had arrived, and the gunner's mind was sharp, his fingers steady. He squeezed the trigger. The first shot rang out with a surprising clarity, cutting through the air and striking a Japanese soldier in the chest. The force of the shot sent the man crumpling to the ground, his weapon skittering across the earth. For a brief second, the Japanese troops hesitated, as if unsure whether they had heard what they thought they had. But the gunner didn't wait. He fired again, this time hitting another soldier, then a third and a fourth. One by one, the Japanese soldiers began to fall. Each shot was a testament to the gunner's determination and ingenuity, but it was also a demonstration of how such a simple weapon could cause chaos on the battlefield. The surprise factor was undeniable. The Japanese soldiers, used to facing organized fire from the Americans, were now being picked off by a soldier they hadn't even noticed, one using a weapon they couldn't understand. The psychological impact was immediate. In the midst of their well-coordinated attack, the enemy's focus shifted. The sound of the gunshots, the confusion of seeing their comrades fall, created chaos in their ranks. The gunner's weapon, though limited in range and accuracy, had one key advantage. It could be fired quickly and repeatedly, delivering a rapid series of shots before the enemy could react. It wasn't the perfect weapon, it wasn't even close, but it was just what was needed in this crucial moment. The Japanese forces, who had been advancing with confidence, began to falter. What had once seemed like an inevitable victory began to slip from their grasp. In those first few moments, as the gunner's shots echoed through the jungle, the tide of the battle shifted. The Japanese soldiers, once certain of their success, were now uncertain. The element of surprise, born not from advanced technology, but from resourcefulness, had given the U.S. forces a crucial advantage. The gunner's small success had turned the engagement into something far greater. The Japanese commanders, recognizing that their forces were being disrupted by an unexpected threat, were forced to recalibrate their strategy. The attack stalled. In a conflict where every second counted, the gunner's actions, though initially small, became a pivot point. The Japanese had underestimated the Americans, and in doing so, they had miscalculated the true nature of the fight. It wasn't just about weapons or tactics. It was about the human spirit, the ability to adapt and overcome. And in that moment, the scrap gun proved to be far more than a makeshift weapon. It was the embodiment of that spirit. The gunfire had barely stopped echoing through the jungle before the Japanese forces, once confident in their imminent success, began to retreat. Their assault had faltered, thrown off by an enemy they hadn't expected. A soldier with a weapon made of scrap. The confusion among the Japanese troops was palpable. For every soldier they sent forward, another fell. They could not comprehend how a unit so under-equipped, so outnumbered, could fight back with such tenacity. The presence of the gunner and his makeshift rifle had turned the tide of the engagement in a matter of minutes. In the aftermath of the battle, the U.S. forces quickly regained the initiative, capitalizing on the Japanese retreat. The Americans, emboldened by their unexpected victory, pressed forward with a renewed sense of purpose. For the Japanese, the retreat was not only a tactical setback, it was a psychological blow. The enemy had learned the hard way that the Americans were not only resourceful but relentless in their will to fight. The gunner, meanwhile, had no idea that his actions would become a defining moment. For him, it had been another day of survival, another battle in a long campaign. He hadn't fired the gun for recognition or glory. He had fired it because he had no other choice. But the consequences of his success were far-reaching. His actions had given his unit the breathing room they needed to regroup and reorganize, turning what could have been a devastating loss into a hard-fought victory. The aftershocks of his actions rippled through the unit. In a war where traditional tactics and technology often failed, the gunner's quick thinking and ingenuity had saved lives. His ability to make use of the limited resources available to him had not only taken out 20 enemy soldiers but had also disrupted the momentum of a larger battle. The engagement, though small in the grand scope of the war, had a significant impact on the tactical thinking of U.S. forces. Officers, recognizing the success of this unorthodox approach, began to consider how they could better utilize the resources at hand. While they would continue to rely on standard-issue weaponry, the lesson was clear. Victory in the Pacific would often depend not just on firepower, but on the willingness to adapt, to improvise, and to think creatively in the face of adversity. For the Japanese, the battle had raised questions about their strategy. They had relied heavily on traditional military superiority and technology, but had underestimated the American ability to innovate. The psychological shock of facing a weapon so unexpected and crude left them questioning their own assumptions about the American resolve. A sense of doubt began to take root, not just on Guadalcanal, but across the Pacific theater. The Japanese had been taught to believe in the superiority of their weapons and tactics. Yet here, in the jungle, it was a soldier's quick thinking with a homemade gun that had disrupted their plans. But the consequences didn't stop there. The loss of 20 soldiers, each one a trained and experienced combatant, was a blow to the Japanese, not just in terms of manpower but morale. In a war where manpower was stretched thin, the loss of such a number was felt deeply. Japanese commanders had already been under pressure to maintain control over the vast Pacific territories, and defeats like these only compounded their problems. For the U.S. forces, the victory on Guadalcanal was more than a tactical win. It was a morale boost. The gunner's success, though it may have seemed small in the greater scope of the war, had sent a message to his comrades. Even in the most desperate situations, even with the most rudimentary equipment, victory was possible. The scrap gun had become a symbol of American resilience and resourcefulness. The outcome of the engagement on Guadalcanal was a microcosm of the larger struggle between the United States and Japan in the Pacific. Although this battle was one of many fought over the island, it served as a pivotal turning point for both sides, reshaping not only tactics but also the broader strategic situation in the Pacific theater. For the U.S. forces, the victory was a critical psychological and tactical win. The gunner's ingenuity, while not a decisive factor in the larger context of the war, demonstrated the importance of adaptability in warfare. It reinforced a growing understanding that, in the Pacific, success did not always rely on sheer firepower or advanced technology. It was the ability to improvise, to turn scarcity into a strategic advantage, that often made the difference. The Japanese retreat from this engagement gave the U.S. forces the chance to consolidate their positions, re-establish supply lines, and reinforced their hold on the island, which had become a key strategic asset for the Allies. Guadalcanal was more than just a battle. It was the first major Allied offensive against Japanese territory and, if lost, could have had a severe impact on the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese had hoped to reclaim the island and use it as a launching point to strike at the heart of Allied shipping lanes. The loss on Guadalcanal, following their failure to re-establish control, sent shockwaves through the Japanese command structure. It was a symbol of their inability to hold ground in the face of a determined American adversary. The defeat on Guadalcanal led to a gradual shift in Japanese strategy. With each failure to dislodge the Americans from their strongholds, Japanese leadership began to realize that their momentum in the Pacific was faltering. The Imperial Army, for all its strength, was increasingly stretched thin. The battle for Guadalcanal marked the beginning of a longer period of strategic retreat for Japan. By the end of 1943, Japan's capacity to conduct offensive operations in the Pacific had been severely undermined. Meanwhile, the U.S. military learned valuable lessons in innovation and resourcefulness. The ingenuity shown by soldiers like the gunner using what was available to them, whether it was scraps from destroyed tanks, parts from old aircraft, or improvised tools, became an enduring lesson in how the U.S. would fight the rest of the war. It also highlighted the need for more efficient, rapid resupply methods, as well as the necessity of fostering creative problem-solving within the ranks. The success of this small engagement, in which a soldier's scrap weapon turned the tide, provided a glimpse of how American forces would approach future battles, with relentless resourcefulness and a deep belief in their ability to adapt to any situation. For the Japanese, the aftershocks were felt beyond Guadalcanal. The defeat forced them to reconsider their tactics and their ability to fight in the dense jungles of the Pacific. The Japanese military, which had long relied on the overwhelming force of its technology, was forced to adapt to the new reality of warfare in the Pacific. A battle not just for terrain, but for hearts and minds, one where the resilience of the human spirit often triumphed over technological superiority. The myth of Japanese invincibility began to crack, not just among the Allied forces, but within the ranks of the Japanese themselves. The gunners' actions, though small in the grand scheme of the war, were emblematic of the broader shift in American strategy. It wasn't about superior firepower or advanced machinery. It was about adapting to the environment, overcoming seemingly insurmountable odds, and using every tool at one's disposal to fight back. As the U.S. forces prepared for the battles to come, from the Philippines to Okinawa, this lesson would shape the way they fought and the kind of victories they achieved. The engagement on Guadalcanal, while a small chapter in the grand narrative of the Pacific War, carries with it a profound lesson in the nature of warfare. It was not just the gunfire, nor the crude weapon that fired it, that made this moment significant. It was the resilience, resourcefulness, and adaptability of the human spirit under fire. In a conflict dominated by technological advancements and the sheer scale of destruction, it was a soldier's ability to make do with what little he had that proved to be a game-changer. The gunner's makeshift rifle, constructed from parts scavenged from the wreckage of war, was more than just a tool of combat. It was a symbol of survival, of the will to continue when everything seemed lost. In the heat of battle, with the odds stacked against him, he did not rely on the might of tanks or the precision of fighter planes. Instead, he relied on his ability to improvise, to adapt to the unique challenges of the jungle, and to fight with the tools at hand. It was not a sophisticated weapon, nor a marvel of engineering, but it was exactly what was needed in that moment. It was a weapon born of desperation and creativity, and it changed the course of the engagement, and perhaps the course of the war. The lessons learned on Guadalcanal would echo throughout the Pacific campaign. The Allies, particularly the Americans, would learn to fight not just with their advanced technology, but with their minds, adapting tactics, improvising weapons, and making the most of limited resources. It would be the ability to innovate under pressure that would define their success in battles yet to come, from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. It wasn't always about having the best equipment, it was about how well one could use what they had. And the gunner's weapon, though crude, was the perfect example of this principle in action. For the Japanese, the battle marked a significant turning point. It was not just a defeat in the Pacific, it was a blow to the myth of their technological and military superiority. The Americans, though outnumbered and outgunned, had shown that they could win not through overwhelming force, but through innovation, determination, and a refusal to be beaten. The psychological impact of this shift was profound, both for the Japanese soldiers on the ground and for their commanders back in Japan. Guadalcanal was the beginning of a long retreat for the Imperial Army, one that would eventually lead to Japan's surrender in 1945. In the end, the gunner's scrap rifle was more than just a battlefield weapon. It was a testament to the human ability to adapt, to overcome, and to fight for survival against all odds. It was a reminder that, in war, it is often the most unexpected solutions that prove to be the most effective. In the jungles of Guadalcanal, a weapon built from the remnants of war helped change the course of history, proving that the ingenuity of a single individual could have a far-reaching impact in the largest of conflicts. As the war would show, technology alone would never win wars. It would always be the men and women who fought, who sacrificed, and who innovated under pressure that would ultimately define the outcome. And in this battle, the gunner with his homemade weapon was a true symbol of that spirit.